Okay, let's get into this. We all kind of assume, don't we, that the medicines we take are, properly tested, rigorously checked, safe.
Right. That's the bedrock assumption.
Sure.
But what if it's not quite as solid as we think?
And that's really the core of what we're talking about today, isn't it?
Exactly. We're doing a deep dive into this book, The Illusion of Evidence-Based Medicine by Jon Jureidini and Leman B. McHenry. And it really pokes holes in that fundamental trust.
The illusion of evidence-based medicine. Wow, yeah, that title alone makes you stop and think. What's the main thrust of their argument?
Their central point is pretty stark. They argue that the pharmaceutical industry's drive for profit fundamentally compromises the integrity, the reliability of what we call evidence-based medicine.
Okay, evidence-based medicine. That's the approach that really took off in the 90s, right? The whole idea of using randomized, placebo-controlled trials to guide practice.
Precisely. Moving away from just intuition or tradition towards, hard data, supposedly hard data.
Supposedly, yeah. So how does this profit motive actually corrupt that process? That's what we're digging into, isn't it? How it happens and what it means for the medical knowledge we all rely on.
That's the mission. And it's worth noting, the book focuses a lot on the situation in U.S. academic medicine, but the implications,
Yeah.
they're global. This affects medical understanding everywhere.
And it's not just an abstract academic critique for the authors, is it? There's a personal angle here.
There is. Their work together actually started back in 2007. They were consultants for a law firm dealing with litigation over industry-sponsored research.
Ah, so they saw it firsthand.
Yes, that direct exposure to legal cases alleging scientific misconduct,
Yeah.
that really kicked off their deeper investigation and led to this book.
Okay, so let's unpack this crisis of credibility they talk about. What are the key drivers here?
Well, a huge one is just how much control the industry has over testing its own drugs. They own the trial data, basically.
On the day, meaning they can't pick and choose.
Exactly. They can choose which trial results get published, usually the positive ones, unsurprisingly, and negative results. They can often be kept quiet, citing intellectual property rights.
So you only see the good news. It creates a skewed picture from the start.
Totally skewed. It's like only showing your best exam results and hiding the failures.
The book mentions key opinion leaders, too, KOLs, calling them product champions. What's that about?
Right. KOLs. These are influential doctors, academics, big names in their fields. Companies actively vet them, looking for people likely to be, supportive.
Supportive meaning favorable to their drugs.
Yes. They're often paid through things like advisory boards, speakers bureaus. They present trial results at conferences and educational settings.
Yep.
But often without a really critical eye, they're chosen to champion the product.
So they lend their credibility, but it's maybe not entirely objective.
That's the concern. Their influence is huge, shaping how other doctors prescribe and how the public sees a drug.
And it goes even deeper, right? Down to how the actual research papers get written.
Oh, absolutely. This part is fascinating. Often, the drug company hires a medical communication firm, a third party, to actually draft the manuscript reporting the trial results.
So not the researchers themselves.
Sometimes the named authors, who are often these KOLs, have relatively little input on the initial draft. That draft then gets approved not just by them, but by the company's marketing department, their medical department, their legal team.
Wow. So marketing goals can potentially outweigh just reporting the science accurately.
That's the argument. The primary goal can shift from objective reporting to creating the most favorable impression possible. Even choosing which journal to publish in could be a marketing tactic.
And they can use these KOLs to push drugs for uses they're not even approved for, off-label stuff.
Yeah, that's another angle. Direct promotion of off-label uses by the company itself is illegal in most places. But KOLs can educate their peers about these uses at conferences or in publications, effectively getting around the regulations. It's a loophole.
It paints a picture where the system seems, vulnerable to manipulation. And this focus on profit affects research priorities too, doesn't it, on a bigger scale?
It does. If you think about it, the big money is often in drugs for chronic conditions common in wealthy countries, things like lifestyle drugs. Meanwhile, essential medicines for diseases devastating poorer nations might get neglected because, frankly, there's less profit potential.
Market demand versus actual medical need.
Exactly. It skews the whole research landscape.
Okay, let's dive into some of the specific examples the book uses. These case studies of misconduct. Paroxetine Paxil, or Seraxat, comes up first, specifically something called Study 329.
Right, Study 329. This looked at paroxetine for depression in adolescents. And the key finding, or rather non-finding, was that it failed to show effectiveness on its main pre-specified outcome.
Failed. But wasn't it published positively?
That's the crux of it. It failed on the primary endpoint, and it raised safety flags. Yet the initial publication back in 2001 by Keller and colleagues spun it quite positively.
That sounds problematic. Did anyone challenge this?
Oh yes, it became a major issue. The U.S. Department of Justice eventually went after the manufacturer, GlaxoSmithKline, for various practices, including misrepresenting this study. It resulted in a massive fine, $3 billion.
$3 billion. And that Keller paper was part of the evidence.
The key part, yes.
Then there was this RI8 initiative, restoring invisible and abandoned trials. What did they do?
RI8 is all about getting access to hidden or misreported trial data and reanalyzing it. One of the book's authors, Jon Jureidini, led a team that did exactly this for Study 329. They got hold of the original individual patient data.
And it published their reanalysis in 2015. What did they find? Something different, I assume.
Vastly different. The reanalysis showed that the original paper deceptively downplayed serious adverse events, particularly things related to suicide risk.
How did they downplay it?
By using some, let's say, creative coding. Different types of negative emotional or behavioral events like agitation, anxiety, emotional swings were split up into different categories. This meant the overall number for suicidality, or similar serious terms, looked lower than it arguably should have. It obscured the real frequency.
So, slicing the data to hide the signal, were there other issues?
Yes. The reanalysis also pointed out major problems with post-hoc analysis.
Meaning they looked at outcomes they hadn't planned to focus on initially.
Exactly. After the main goal, the primary outcome, didn't pan out, the original authors shifted focus to secondary outcomes that looked better, making the drug seem effective when the primary test had failed. That's a big no-no in rigorous science.
And that Medical Communications Agency was involved here, too.
Yes. Scientific Therapeutics Information, STI. They were hired by the sponsor to draft the article and manage the whole process with the authors and the company, shaping the story, essentially.
Okay, let's move to the next case. Citalopram and Escitalopram, Celexa, and Lexapro. Another study on adolescent depression, CIT-MD-18. Similar story.
Very similar themes, unfortunately. This study, sponsored by Forest Laboratories, looked at citalopram in adolescents. It was presented as positive evidence when Forest applied for FDA approval for escitalopram in that age group. But the study itself had some serious flaws.
Flaws in how it was run.
Big ones. A major issue was unblinding. At several research sites, the patients and the investigators figured out who was getting the active drug and who was getting the placebo.
That completely undermines the whole point of a double-blind trial, doesn't it? Introduces bias.
Totally. It breaks a fundamental rule. Yet the results were still presented as if it were a rigorously controlled, unbiased study.
And what about the actual results? Were they presented accurately?
Not initially. The effect size, how much difference the drug made, was reported as being much larger than the raw data supported. Forest initially claimed a value of 2.9 on the main outcome measure.
Which wasn't right.
No. They later admitted a calculation error and revised it way down to 0.32, using a different statistical method. But that initial inflated number was out there. And again, STI, the same communications company, was involved in drafting the manuscript.
And the FDA? Did they step in to correct the record on this one?
According to the book, no. There was no significant action taken by the FDA to correct the public record regarding the misreporting in CIT-MD-18.
It's a pattern. The book mentions other examples, too, maybe more briefly. Rofecoxib Vioxx. That was a big withdrawal.
Huge. Vioxx, marketed by Merck for arthritis pain. It was heavily promoted, partly based on a trial called Advantage, which the book argues was really more about marketing than science. And of course, Vioxx was pulled in 2004 because of serious cardiovascular risks, heart attacks, strokes. Ghostwriting was reportedly used to downplay those risks, too.
And fen-phen, the diet drug.
Fenfluramine, phentermine. Yeah, there was push for weight loss, again with safety issues kind of swept under the rug initially. It got withdrawn in 1997 after links to serious heart valve problems and lung issues emerged.
Hormone therapy, too, like Prempro, estrogen progestin.
Right, Wyeth's Prempro. It was marketed heavily for kind of anti-aging benefits and protecting the heart. Then major studies showed it actually increased breast cancer risk. The book details how Wyeth used a communications company, DesignRight, to generate ghost-written articles to downplay that cancer risk, defend unproven heart benefits, and push off-label uses.
Then there's resiglitazone, Avandia for diabetes.
GSK's Avandia, marketed for type 2 diabetes. Again, concerns mounted about cardiovascular risks, leading to its withdrawal in Europe, and heavy restrictions in the U.S., though some of those U.S. restrictions were later eased.
And we can't forget OxyContin.
No. Purdue Pharma's marketing of oxycodone, OxyContin for chronic pain is
Yeah.
infamous now. It's seen as a key driver of the opioid epidemic. Purdue pleaded guilty to felony misbranding in 2007 and paid huge fines, but the damage was and is immense.
One more Infuse, the bone growth product.
Medtronic's Infuse, used in spinal surgery, promoted in top journals as safe and effective. But later investigations, including by the U.S. Senate, found the physician authors often had massive undisclosed financial ties to Medtronic. Plus, the company allegedly manipulated publications to push unapproved uses and hide serious side effects. The Spine Journal actually dedicated a whole issue to exposing it.
That's extraordinary for a journal to do.
Unprecedented, really. It highlighted just how bad the situation was perceived to be.
So these cases paint a pretty bleak picture. What are the wider consequences, the systemic problems that let this happen?
Well, one big ethical problem is for the doctors, the investigators involved in these trials. What happens if they find dangers, but they've signed confidentiality agreements with the sponsor?
They're stuck.
Exactly. The book mentions people like Nancy Olivieri, Betty Dong, Aubrey Blumson, David Healy researchers who faced serious pushback, even career damage, for trying to speak out about safety concerns they found in industry trials.
And it affects the institutions too, universities.
That's a major point the authors make. Universities are under constant financial pressure, needing research funding. This can make them, perhaps sometimes unintentionally, more aligned with industry partners. The book talks about the rise of the corporate university, where commercial interests might start to overshadow the traditional mission of seeking truth for the public good. Academic integrity can take a hit.
And the KOLs, the key opinion leaders, are kind of the linchpins connecting industry to the academic and clinical worlds.
Absolutely. They wear multiple hats: investigators on the trials, members of company advisory boards, the named authors on the papers, presenters at educational events. Companies cultivate these relationships carefully, even keeping databases of thought leaders.
It's all geared towards driving sales, isn't it? Sometimes even, as the book suggests, by making us think we need a drug we might not.
Yes, the concept of disease-mongering comes up. Pharmaceutical marketing isn't just about promoting a drug for an existing condition. It can be about raising awareness, broadening the definition of an illness, maybe making normal life experiences seem like medical problems that need treatment. Expanding diagnostic categories, like we've seen with the DSM in psychiatry, can play into this. Create the market, then sell the product.
And the regulators, like the FDA in the U.S., are they acting as an effective check?
The book raises serious doubts. They point to political pressures, intense industry lobbying, the fact that a significant chunk of the FDA's drug review budget comes from fees paid by the companies themselves.
The Prescription Drug User Fee Act, PDUFA.
That's the one. Critics call it a pay-to-play system, arguing it creates pressure to approve drugs faster, maybe without enough scrutiny. There are also concerns about conflicts of interest on the advisory committees that recommend approvals, and anecdotes of FDA reviewers feeling discouraged from challenging company data too strongly.
And then there's advertising directly to patients, which happens in the U.S. and New Zealand.
Direct-to-consumer advertising, yeah.
Yeah.
That adds another layer, creating patient demand, maybe for drugs that aren't the best option or even necessary. Patients might pressure their doctors based on an ad they saw.
When you step back, it even feels like a betrayal of the people who volunteer for these trials.
That's a powerful point the book makes. If a trial isn't really designed as a genuine scientific test, if it's skewed towards a positive result for marketing purposes, then the participants, they're essentially being used as marketing props, aren't they? Without full transparency about the real goals or the potential risks being downplayed, their consent isn't truly informed.
So to counter this, the book talks about needing a rigorous conception of science in medicine. What does that involve? They bring in philosophy of science here.
They do. They lean heavily on Karl Popper's philosophy. Popper emphasized falsification, the idea that a scientific theory isn't really scientific unless it can, in principle, be proven wrong through testing. Science advances by trying to refute hypotheses, not just confirm them.
So genuine testing, trying to break the theory.
Exactly. And it requires objectivity, disinterestedness in the outcome, which is, the polar opposite of having a massive financial stake in proving your product works.
Yeah.
The book contrasts this with what it calls industry science, which it sees as closer to Richard Feynman's idea of cargo cult science.
Cargo cult science? What's that?
It's like going through the motions of science, having the labs, the procedures, the publications, but missing the core element of critical skepticism, the willingness to find out you're wrong. It looks like science, but it isn't really.
How does industry research often fall short of this rigorous standard, according to the book?
They list several ways industry trials can be designed to subtly favor the sponsor's drug. Things like using placebos that aren't truly inert. Maybe they cause side effects that subtly unblind participants. These are called placebos.
Ah, so the comparison isn't fair.
Right. Or adding endpoints after seeing the data that's post hoc analysis again. Combining different outcomes together to make results look better, conflating endpoints, hiding the fact that people involved knew who got the real drug, selectively dropping patients from the analysis if the results don't look good, and of course delaying or just never publishing negative results.
It sounds like stacking the deck.
Pretty much. The book also mentions the logical fallacy of affirming the consequence. If my drug works, the trial will be positive. The trial is positive, therefore my drug works. But that ignores other reasons why a trial might be positive.
Like chance or bias or flawed design.
Exactly. And the flip side, modus tollens, if the drug doesn't work, the trial should be negative. If the trial is negative, maybe the drug doesn't work. That logic often gets ignored when the commercial stakes are high. They also bring in Deborah Mayo's concept of severe testing, arguing industry trials often fail to put their hypotheses to a genuinely tough test.
It's a far cry from the history of clinical trials. Lind testing citrus for scurvy, the development of blinding, randomization, all designed to reduce bias.
Precisely. Those methods evolved to get closer to the truth. The book acknowledges the hierarchy of evidence in evidence-based medicine, with RCTs at the top, but stresses that how those RCTs are done is crucial. And also, what outcomes are measured? Are we looking at actual patient survival or just some lab marker? That hierarchy of outcomes is often overlooked.
Okay, let's talk about medical journals. They're supposed to be the gatekeepers, the trusted source. How do they fit into this picture?
Well, the book argues they're far from immune to industry influence. Journals rely heavily on income from selling reprints of articles. Guess who buys the most reprints?
The company whose drug looks good in the article.
Bingo. Often buying thousands, tens of thousands of copies to distribute to doctors. Then there's advertising revenue, grants for publishing supplements, or supporting continuing medical education, all primarily from industry. This creates, at the very least, a potential conflict of interest for the journals and their editors.
Can it influence what gets published?
The authors argue it can. Journals might be less inclined to publish studies that are critical of major advertisers, or that show negative results for widely used drugs.
And ghostwriting comes up again here.
Big time. Medical communication companies drafting papers attributed to academics, honorary authors, often KOLs. It makes marketing look like independent science. The book mentions specific ghostwriting programs run by these agencies, like Case PP.
And the journal editors, are they cracking down on this?
The book suggests it's inconsistent at best. Editors are powerful gatekeepers, but sometimes, even when presented with evidence of ghostwriting or other issues, journals have been reluctant to take strong action, like retracting flawed papers. Richard Smith, a former editor of the BMJ, famously said journals can operate like an extension of the marketing arm of drug companies.
Wow, that's a damning statement from a former editor.
It is, and this information cascade doesn't stop with journals. Trial results are blasted out via posters, abstracts, presentations at medical conferences, which are themselves heavily sponsored by industry.
And even the clinical practice guidelines that doctors use.
Conflicts of interest can creep in there too, influencing the recommendations that guide treatment decisions for millions.
So faced with all this, what can be done? The book discusses some solutions, dividing them into minimally effective responses and a radical proposal. What falls into the minimal category?
Things like transparency policies making researchers disclose their financial ties to industry. The book argues these are necessary, but haven't really fixed the core problem. People disclose, but the biased research might still get published and influence practice.
So disclosure isn't a cure-all. What else?
Better access to data. Things like pushing for a retraction of flawed studies, the RIAT initiative we discussed, trial registration, so a trial started even if it wasn't published, the All Trials campaign demanding access to results, Cochrane reviews that synthesize evidence. These are all good steps, but have limitations.
Like what?
Well, retraction relies on journal editors who might be conflicted. All Trials still struggles to get access to the raw individual patient data, which you really need for independent checks. And Cochrane reviews, while valuable, are often based on the published literature. So if the published studies are biased, the review might just synthesize that bias. Garbage in, garbage out.
Makes sense. Any other minimal responses?
Restrictions on marketing. The ban on direct-to-consumer ads in most countries, except the US and New Zealand, is cited as a rare success, but off-label promotion via KOLs continues. And then there's government action investigations, lawsuits, like Senator Grassley's work in the US, or the Sunshine Act, requiring disclosure of payments to doctors. These can uncover problems, but they're often reactive, not preventative, and don't change the fundamental system.
Okay, so if those are minimally effective, what's the radical proposal?
It's pretty fundamental. They propose taking clinical trials largely out of the hands of the companies whose products are being tested.
How would that work? Who would fund and run them?
The idea is publicly funded, independent trials.
Right.
Maybe financed by a tax on the pharmaceutical and medical device industries themselves. Let companies focus on discovering molecules, early development. But when it comes to the large-scale trials needed for approval, those should be run independently. Maybe universities or dedicated public institutes compete for funding to run these trials rigorously.
So separating the testing from the financial interest in the outcome.
Exactly. And they also suggest journals need to rethink their role, maybe focus less on acting as gatekeepers based on perceived importance, and more on ensuring methodological soundness. Perhaps initial peer review just checks for basic interest. Then dedicated experts in health technology assessment do the really deep dive into the methods and results independent of the journal's financial interests.
That would be a huge shift.
A massive shift, hence radical.
The book wraps up with a philosophical point, contrasting Karl Popper's ideas with social constructivism. Why bring that in?
It's about the nature of scientific knowledge itself. Popper believed in a kind of robust realism, that science, through rigorous testing and falsification, can get progressively closer to objective truth about the world.
Where's social constructivism?
Social constructivist views tend to emphasize that scientific knowledge is, to some extent, shaped by social processes, choices, interpretations. It's choice-laden, not purely objective. The authors use this to push back against any argument that what industry is doing is just, science done in a different corporate way.
They're saying, no, it's not just a different way, it's a corruption of the scientific ideal.
Precisely. They argue that the profit motive inherent in industry science undermines the very possibility of the disinterested, critical testing that Popper saw as essential. They acknowledge science as a social activity. Popper himself stressed the importance of peer review, intersubjective criticism, but they maintain its rationality depends on that openness to criticism and falsification, which commercial interests often block.
They mentioned the Sokol hoax briefly, too.
Yeah, as a sort of side point about how peer review standards can vary wildly, even in other fields, let alone in medical journals facing commercial pressures. It highlights the potential vulnerability of the peer review process itself.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, digging into the illusion of evidence-based medicine. If you had to boil it down, what's the single most important takeaway for listeners?
I think the core message is about the potential fragility of the evidence base we rely on for incredibly important health decisions. The influence of commercial interests runs deep, potentially distorting the medical knowledge landscape in ways that can affect patient care. It's about the erosion of trust.
It definitely gives you pause. You're left wondering, if the foundation isn't as solid as we thought, what does that mean when you or your family need medical treatment? How do you navigate that? It really underscores the need for critical thinking, doesn't it, for everyone?
Absolutely. And for anyone whose interest is piqued, digging into the book itself by Jureidini and McHenry is highly recommended. There's a lot more detail and nuance in there, along with references to other key researchers working on these issues.